The room you thought would stay ordinary is about to become the place where silence finally breaks. There are moments that arrive without warning, moments so powerful that everything happening around them suddenly feels distant. Voices fade. Faces blur. Time seems to hesitate. And this was one of those moments. The person you love had been holding something inside for far longer than anyone realized. Not because the feeling was uncertain. Not because their heart had changed. But because saying it openly would mean crossing a line they could never uncross. For days, they had rehearsed calmer ways to tell you. A private conversation. A carefully written message. Maybe a quiet moment when nobody else was watching. But destiny does not always wait for perfect circumstances. Stay a little longer, because what happened next was nothing like the moment they had imagined. There were people everywhere. Some were talking. Others were distracted. A few barely noticed the tension building beneath the surface. But the person you love noticed you. And for one strange second, everything inside them became clear. They saw your face and remembered every unfinished conversation. Every moment they almost reached out. Every time pride told them to remain quiet. Every night they wondered whether you had already started moving toward a future that no longer included them. Then something shifted. Not outside. Inside. The hesitation disappeared. They stepped forward. Someone nearby turned toward them, confused. Another person stopped speaking. And then, without lowering their voice, without hiding behind another excuse, the person you love finally said what they had been carrying. They loved you. Not quietly. Not indirectly. They said it loudly enough for everyone around them to hear. The entire atmosphere changed. But here is where the story becomes extraordinary. You might think the biggest moment was the confession. It wasn't. The real turning point came immediately afterward. Because the room did not react the way they expected. There was no simple celebration. No predictable ending. Instead, someone standing nearby slowly looked at you as though they suddenly understood something they had misunderstood for a very long time. Another person exchanged a stunned glance with someone across the room. And the person you love? They didn't take their eyes off you. They had reached the point where your response mattered more than everyone else's opinion combined. Think about that. What makes someone who has protected their feelings for so long suddenly become willing to reveal everything in front of everyone? It usually isn't impulse. It is realization. They had realized that staying silent was beginning to cost more than being vulnerable. And perhaps something similar is happening in your own path right now. There comes a moment when the future stops rewarding hesitation. A moment when the version of you that keeps waiting must make space for the version of you that is finally ready to receive clarity. But don't rush toward the conclusion yet. Because seconds after that confession, something happened behind you. A voice interrupted the silence. The person you love froze. Several people turned at once. And what was revealed in that next moment completely changed the meaning of why they had chosen to confess their love publicly in the first place. Stay with this story. Because the confession was only the beginning. The interruption came from the one person nobody expected to speak. For a second, even the person you love looked uncertain. Not afraid. Not regretful. Just surprised. Because the voice behind you belonged to someone who had quietly known more about this connection than anyone else in that room. They stepped forward slowly and said something that instantly changed the energy. This didn't begin today. Those words landed differently. Suddenly, the public confession was no longer just an emotional impulse. It had a history. A hidden one. The person speaking revealed that the one you love had been trying to find the courage to tell you the truth for much longer than you realized. There had been messages written and deleted. Conversations started and abandoned. Plans made, then postponed at the last second. And every time they stepped back, it was for the same reason. They believed the timing was wrong. Pause here, because this is where the story turns. The person you love had convinced themselves that they needed everything to be perfect before they could stand in front of you with complete honesty. The right day. The right place. The right words. But perfection kept moving farther away. And while they waited, they began noticing something that unsettled them. You were changing. Not in a negative way. You were becoming stronger. More independent. More focused on where your life was going. There was a different confidence around you now, almost as though your future had started calling you forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. That realization hit them harder than they expected. What if they waited too long? What if the next chapter of your life opened without them? What if silence became the decision they never intended to make? That is why they screamed their love in front of everyone. They weren't trying to create a spectacle. They were trying to stop hiding from the truth. But then the unexpected person in the room revealed one more detail. Earlier that same day, the person you love had apparently said something privately. Something nobody expected to hear from them. They had said, "If I get one real chance, I'm not going to waste it pretending anymore." And suddenly their public confession made complete sense. Stay close to this moment. Because when someone finally becomes willing to risk looking vulnerable, it often means something inside them has already changed permanently. The old hesitation has lost its power. The future has become more important than the fear of being misunderstood. And perhaps that is why everyone in the room became so quiet. They weren't simply watching someone confess love. They were watching someone become completely honest in real time. If this story is speaking to something you've felt but never been able to explain, share it with someone who understands that kind of connection. And if you want to stay with this journey, leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss where this revelation leads next. Because the next thing the person you love did surprised even the person who had just defended them. They walked directly toward you. No hesitation now. No audience mattered anymore. And instead of repeating, "I love you," they said something much quieter. Something meant only for you. "I need you to know why I waited." Those 7 words changed everything again. Because the reason wasn't rejection. It wasn't uncertainty. And it wasn't another person. The real reason had been connected to a promise they made long ago, a promise involving your future, their future, and one decision they believed they had to make before they could come toward you honestly. Then they reached into their pocket. Someone in the room gasped. And what they pulled out was not what anyone expected. Wait until you understand what that object represented. Because the confession was emotional. But the promise behind it? That was the part that could change the entire path ahead. What they pulled from their pocket looked almost insignificant at first, a small folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, as if it had been opened and closed more times than anyone could count. But the moment the person you love looked down at it, their expression changed. The confidence they had shown only seconds earlier softened into something deeper. Something personal. Something they had clearly carried alone. They unfolded the paper carefully, then looked directly at you and said, "This is why I couldn't speak sooner." Nobody moved. The room that had been filled with noise only minutes ago now felt suspended between 2 different futures. One where everything remained as it had been. And another where one truth changed the direction of everything. Stay with this moment, because the paper itself was not the secret. The words written on it were. Months earlier, during a period when they had been uncertain about what direction their life should take, the person you love had written themselves a promise. Not a promise to forget you. Not a promise to walk away. Almost the opposite. They had promised that if they ever came toward you, they would come with honesty instead of confusion. They would not offer half decisions. They would not speak from loneliness. And they would not ask you to believe in a future they were not prepared to help build. That was why they waited. They wanted to become certain before asking you to trust their certainty. And suddenly, many things that once seemed confusing began making sense. The distance. The hesitation. The moments when they seemed ready to tell you something and then stopped. They had not been trying to erase the connection. They had been trying to understand whether they were strong enough to protect what the connection could become. But here is where everything shifted again. At the bottom of that old promise was a date. Today's date. Someone standing nearby noticed it first. Their eyes widened. The person you love gave a small, almost unbelievable smile. Because months ago, when they wrote that note, they had chosen this exact day as the moment when they would stop hiding from whatever answer their heart had reached. And now you understand why the confession had exploded out of them so suddenly. This moment had been approaching long before anyone in that room knew it. What if some turning points are like that? Quietly moving toward you while ordinary life continues around them. A conversation feels delayed. A decision seems unfinished. A connection appears uncertain. Then one day, all those scattered pieces suddenly reveal that they were leading somewhere. The person you love folded the note again. But they didn't put it back into their pocket. Instead, they held it out toward you. "This belongs with you now," they said. And there was something powerful about that gesture. They were no longer protecting the evidence of their feelings. They were giving it to you. No hidden meaning. No guessing. No emotional maze. Just truth placed directly into your hands. Wait till the final moment of this part, because one more surprise was still waiting. As you looked down at the note, you noticed something written on the back. A sentence they had never mentioned. It was newer than everything else. The handwriting looked fresh. And when you read it, the noise of the room seemed to disappear all over again. It said, "If they still believe in me, I'm ready to choose the future I was once too afraid to imagine." The person you love watched your face carefully. Not demanding an answer. Not forcing the moment. Simply allowing you to see the version of them that had finally stopped running from clarity. And that is when something extraordinary happened. One by one, the people around you began stepping away. Not because the moment had ended. Because they understood it no longer belonged to them. Soon, the crowd that had witnessed the loudest confession became the quiet background to something far more meaningful. Two people. One old promise. And a future that suddenly felt much closer than it had yesterday. But just as the person you love began to speak again, your phone lit up. A message appeared. You looked at the screen. Then back at them. Because the name attached to that message was connected to the very reason this entire story had nearly unfolded differently. And the first words on the screen were enough to make you realize one final truth had still not been revealed. The message on your screen carried a name you had not expected to see tonight. For a brief second, everything around you seemed to lose its sound. The person you love noticed your expression immediately. They did not ask who it was. They already knew. And that was the first clue that this message was connected to far more than the confession you had just witnessed. You opened it. The words were simple. You deserve to know what really happened. Nothing dramatic. Nothing threatening. Yet somehow, that single sentence changed the atmosphere completely. The message came from someone who had been close enough to witness the person you loved during the months when they kept pulling away from you. Someone who had watched them struggle with the decision to speak. And now, at the exact moment their hidden promise had finally reached your hands, this person was ready to reveal the missing piece. Stay a little longer. Because what you were about to discover explained why the person you love had chosen such an unforgettable way to confess. The message continued. Months earlier, they had been offered an opportunity that could completely change the direction of their future. A new beginning. A major decision. A path that might have taken them far away from everything familiar. At first, everyone assumed they would accept immediately. It looked perfect from the outside. But there was one problem. Every version of that future seemed to move them farther away from you. They tried to convince themselves that feelings should not influence such an important decision. They tried to become practical, logical, detached. But every time they imagined starting that new chapter, one question returned. What happens if I build everything I wanted and realize I left behind the person I wanted to share it with? That question changed them. Not overnight. Slowly. Quietly. Until today. The person who sent the message revealed that earlier that morning, the person you love had finally made their choice. They had turned down the version of the future that required them to pretend you meant nothing. Not because they wanted to sacrifice their dreams. Because they had discovered something bigger. They wanted a future where ambition and love did not have to compete. A future where growth did not require disappearing. A future where two people could move forward without abandoning what mattered most. And suddenly you understood why their confession had been so loud. It wasn't only, "I love you." It was, "I am done building a life that leaves no room for what is true." That is the detail nobody in the crowd understood. They thought they had witnessed a spontaneous declaration. But you were beginning to see something else. You had witnessed a decision. A person choosing honesty after months of hesitation. A person refusing to let another chapter begin with words left unsaid. If you've ever reached a moment where you had to choose between continuing the old pattern and finally becoming honest about what you wanted, share this story with someone who would understand. Leave your perspective in the comments, and subscribe if you want to stay connected to stories about the moments that quietly change everything. Because this one still wasn't finished. You looked up from the phone. The person you love was standing closer now. Their eyes were calm. Almost relieved. Then they asked you something nobody in that room had expected. "Do you want to know what I chose instead?" You didn't even have time to answer. They reached into their jacket again. This time they pulled out a sealed envelope. Your name was written across the front. Underneath it were 3 words. "For our future." The crowd had already witnessed the confession. You had discovered the hidden promise. Now there was only one question left. What could possibly be inside that envelope that made the person you love smile as though tonight was not the ending of something, but the first glimpse of a life they had already started preparing for? The envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt. Not because of what it weighed. Because of what it represented. The person you love placed it gently into your hands, and for the first time since their confession, they looked almost nervous again. Not uncertain. Just deeply aware that whatever happened next could change the meaning of everything that came before it. You opened the envelope slowly. Inside was not a dramatic announcement. Not a perfect plan. Not a promise built on fantasy. It was something far more powerful. A handwritten page titled, "The Life I Want to Build." Your eyes moved across the first few lines. They had written about peace. About stability. About becoming stronger without becoming colder. About creating a future that felt meaningful instead of impressive from a distance. Then your name appeared. And suddenly you understood. This was not a letter asking you to complete their life. It was a vision of a life they had finally become brave enough to imagine sharing with you. Stay with this moment, because one sentence changed the entire meaning of the confession. They had written, "I don't want you to follow my future. I want to discover whether we can create one that belongs to both of us." You looked up. The person you love was watching quietly. No pressure. No rehearsed speech. Just truth. And something inside the moment softened. Because love sounded different now. It was no longer only the loud declaration everyone had heard. It was intention. Responsibility. Growth. The willingness to stop hiding behind "someday." What if this is the real turning point? Not when someone says the biggest words, but when their choices begin matching those words. The page continued. There were no unrealistic guarantees. Instead, there were possibilities. Places they wanted to see. Things they wanted to accomplish. Ordinary mornings they strangely looked forward to. Even small details they remembered about you, things you probably assumed had gone unnoticed. A dream you once mentioned casually. Something you said you wanted to learn. A place you hoped to visit one day. They remembered. That realization touched you differently than the public confession ever could. Because anyone can be moved by a dramatic moment. But remembering the quiet details? That means someone was listening when you thought nobody was. Then you reached the final paragraph. Your fingers paused. The person you love took one small step closer. And there it was. The real reason they had written, "For our future," on the envelope. They had already made one significant change in their life. Not to force you into their plans. To make space for a conversation they believed the two of you had avoided for too long. They had chosen to remain close enough for the possibility of something real to be explored. No disappearing. No confusing distance. No unfinished sentences. But before you could respond, they said something completely unexpected. I don't need your answer tonight. The room seemed to become even quieter. They continued. I needed you to know the truth tonight. Your decision deserves time. And somehow, those words became more powerful than the confession itself. Because suddenly you were not standing inside a fantasy. You were standing inside something mature. Something patient. Something that respected your future too. Wait, because one final detail remained on that page. At the very bottom, underneath everything else, was a small line written almost like an afterthought. A location. A date. And beside it. If you want to see what I've been preparing, meet me here. You looked at the person you love. They smiled. Not the smile of someone who already knew your answer. The smile of someone finally brave enough to let the future reveal itself honestly. And somewhere inside you, a new question quietly appeared. What had they been preparing at that location? Because if tonight had already changed everything, tomorrow might reveal why this confession was only the first step. By the time you reached the location, one thing was immediately clear: this had not been arranged overnight. The place was quiet. Almost strangely quiet. No crowd. No dramatic display. No attempt to impress anyone. And that alone surprised you. After everything that had happened, the public confession, the hidden note, the envelope, the message, you expected something enormous. Instead, the person you love had brought you somewhere peaceful. Somewhere the future could finally speak without noise around it. They were already waiting. And when they saw you, they did not rush toward you. They simply smiled. A different kind of smile. The kind that comes when someone has spent a long time preparing for a moment but still cannot predict what it will become. Stay here, because what they showed you next explained something you had been wondering since the beginning. They led you toward a small open space overlooking the distance ahead. On a nearby table sat several objects. A notebook. 2 cups. A simple map. And one photograph. Nothing expensive. Nothing exaggerated. But every object represented a conversation you had once shared. You picked up the map first. Several places had been circled. Some were places you had once said you wanted to visit. Others were connected to dreams the person you love had quietly carried for years. Then you opened the notebook. The first page contained one sentence. No fixed destination. Just possibilities worth discussing. That line stopped you. Because suddenly you realized they had not brought you here to announce your future. They had brought you here to ask you to help shape it. There is a difference. A powerful one. The old version of them might have made decisions alone and hoped you would understand afterward. This version wanted conversation before direction, clarity before assumption, partnership before plans. And maybe that was the greatest transformation of all. But something still remained unexplained. The photograph. You reached for it. It showed the two of you from much earlier, a completely ordinary moment you barely remembered. You were not posing. Neither of you knew the photograph was being taken. You were simply talking. Laughing. Completely unaware that someone had captured it. You turned the picture over. A date was written on the back. Beside it were the words, "This was the day I realized." You looked at them immediately. Realized what? They became quiet. Then they finally told you. That photograph had been taken long before they ever admitted their feelings, even to themselves. They remembered looking at you that day and experiencing something unfamiliar. Not excitement. Not obsession. Peace. And that frightened them more than excitement ever could. Because excitement can disappear. But peace makes someone imagine staying. They told you that was the first time they wondered whether you were not simply part of one chapter, but someone who could belong in chapters they had not even lived yet. Think about that for a second. Sometimes the deepest realizations do not arrive through dramatic moments. Sometimes they arrive during laughter. During ordinary conversations. During seconds nobody realizes will become important later. You placed the photograph back on the table. And then the person you love said something even more surprising. The public confession wasn't the brave part. You waited. They looked directly at you. The brave part is what I'm about to ask now. Everything became still again. They did not ask you to promise forever. They did not ask for an immediate answer about the entire future. They asked something much simpler. Can we start again without pretending we already know how the story ends? That question carried more truth than any perfect declaration could have carried. Because real beginnings do not need certainty about every tomorrow. Sometimes they only need two people willing to show up honestly today. But just when you thought you finally understood everything, the person you love reached beneath the notebook and pulled out one final page. Your name was at the top. Underneath it was a question they had never asked you before. And when you read it, you realized this entire journey had been leading toward a decision that belonged not to them, but entirely to you. For the first time, the decision was not hidden inside their heart. It was sitting in front of you. Your name at the top of the page. And beneath it, one question. What kind of future would feel true to you? You read it twice. Not because the words were difficult. Because nobody had prepared you for something so simple. After the confession. After the crowd. After the note, the envelope, the photograph, the plans. You expected another revelation about what they wanted. Instead, they wanted to know what you wanted. And somehow, that changed the entire balance of the moment. The person you love sat across from you and remained completely quiet. They were not trying to influence your answer. They were not filling the silence with promises. They were giving you something that had been missing from this story for a long time. Space. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to decide whether the future they imagined could ever become something you imagined too. Stay with this, because the next detail revealed just how much they had changed. There were blank pages behind the question. No instructions. No predetermined choices. Just empty space waiting for your voice. You looked at them and asked, "Why is all of this blank?" Their answer came softly. Because I realized I kept imagining us without asking what your version of us looks like. That sentence stayed between you. And perhaps this was the moment when their love became more believable than when they had screamed it in front of everyone. Because intensity can announce a feeling. But listening reveals its depth. You picked up the pen. For several seconds, you wrote nothing. Then one word appeared. Peace. The person you love noticed it. You added another. Honesty. Then. Freedom. Growth. Laughter. Trust. You were not writing promises. You were writing foundations. And with every word, the future stopped feeling like something being handed to you. It started feeling like something being created with you. But then you wrote one final word. The person you love leaned slightly closer. Time. They looked at you, and you could see that they understood immediately. You needed time. Not because the connection meant nothing. Because it meant enough not to rush. And their response surprised you. They smiled. Not disappointed. Relieved. I hoped you would say that. You looked up. Why would someone who had waited so long finally confess everything, only to be relieved that you were not giving an immediate answer? Because they had learned the difference between urgency and certainty. Urgency says, decide now. Certainty says, I can remain honest while you decide. That was the version of them standing before you now. And this was not the same person who once hid behind perfect timing. Something had matured. Something had settled. Then they turned to another page in the notebook. There was a short list written there. Not destinations. Not grand plans. Small things. Have one completely honest conversation every week. Celebrate each other's progress. Say what is wrong before silence becomes distance. Never make major decisions based on assumptions. Keep building individual dreams too. You almost laughed. After such a dramatic confession, their vision for love was surprisingly ordinary. And maybe that was exactly why it felt real. They did not want endless dramatic moments. They wanted something sustainable after the dramatic moment ended. Before you could say anything, your eyes noticed one final line at the bottom of the page. It had been written in different ink. Much more recently. You pointed toward it. The person you love became still. The line said, "Tell them what happened the night you almost gave up." You looked directly at them. Their expression changed. Not with fear. With vulnerability. Because there was still one story they had not told you. One night when they had apparently reached the edge of walking away from everything they felt. And what happened during that night was the reason they never completely disappeared from your life. They closed the notebook gently. Then they said, "If you really want to understand why I screamed those words in front of everyone, you need to hear this part." And suddenly, the confession had one final hidden beginning. That night had begun with a decision they were almost certain they would never reverse. The person you love looked away for a moment, as though they could still see the exact room, the exact hour, the exact version of themselves who had nearly chosen silence forever. They told you they had convinced themselves that walking away would be easier. No more wondering. No more waiting for the perfect moment. No more imagining a future they were too uncertain to speak about. So they opened their phone. They found your name. And they began writing what they believed would be their final message to you. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. That was what made it more powerful. It simply said that sometimes people enter our lives at the wrong time, and perhaps the kindest thing they could do was stop holding on to something they did not know how to build. They stared at those words for several minutes. Their finger hovered above send. Then something unexpected happened. A photograph appeared on their screen. Not the photograph sitting on the table now. Another one. An older memory. You were standing somewhere ordinary, looking away from the camera, completely unaware that one day this image would interrupt one of the biggest decisions of their life. Stay close, because what they remembered in that instant became the invisible beginning of everything that followed. They remembered a conversation the two of you had shared months earlier. You had said something almost casually. The future doesn't always need to be clear before you begin walking toward it. You probably did not even realize those words stayed with them. But that night, those words came back. And suddenly they saw what they had been doing. They were not leaving because the connection felt wrong. They were leaving because they could not guarantee how it would end. They had been demanding certainty from something that had never been given a genuine beginning. So they deleted the farewell message. Every word. Then they opened the notebook you had seen earlier and wrote a new sentence instead. Stop asking whether it will work. Ask whether it deserves an honest chance. You looked at them differently after hearing that. Because now the public confession made even more sense. The screaming. The crowd. The complete abandonment of caution. That moment had not begun in front of everyone. It had begun on a quiet night when nobody was watching, when one person decided not to disappear simply because the future remained unwritten. But there was more. They told you that after deleting the message, they made one private commitment. If another real opportunity came to tell you the truth, they would not escape it. No perfect speech. No waiting for some imaginary sign. They would simply speak. Then came the day of the confession. They saw you across that crowded space. They remembered the unsent goodbye. They remembered the photograph. They remembered that sentence in the notebook. And suddenly they understood. This was the opportunity they had promised themselves they would not waste. That was why their voice rose. That was why everyone heard. They were not trying to make the room notice them. They were making sure their own fear could no longer silence them. And now, sitting across from you, they finally asked the question they had been too afraid to ask that night. Do you think I made the right choice by staying? The question hung between you. But before you could answer, something strange caught your attention. There was another page beneath their hand. A page they had been deliberately keeping covered. You gently pointed toward it. They hesitated. Then moved their hand away. At the top was a date you recognized immediately. It was the day after the night they nearly walked away. And beneath that date were 4 words. They almost contacted me. You looked up. Who? The person you love took a slow breath. Because there was someone else connected to that night. Someone who knew they were about to disappear. Someone who had reached out the very next morning with information about you that the person you love had never told you. And what that person revealed became the final reason they stopped seeing your connection as something they should escape. And started seeing it as something they needed to understand. The name they finally whispered was not the one you expected. It belonged to someone who had quietly observed both of you from a distance, someone who had never tried to interfere, never pushed either of you toward a decision, but had noticed the pattern long before either of you were ready to admit it. The morning after that almost goodbye, this person contacted them with one simple question. Are you sure you're walking away for the right reason? The person you love did not answer immediately. They were still carrying the weight of everything from the night before. The deleted message. The photograph. The promise they had written to themselves. And now this unexpected question had appeared like a door opening where they thought there was only a wall. Then came the detail that changed everything. The person on the other end told them about a conversation you had once had. Not a confession. Not a secret promise. Something much quieter. You had apparently spoken about how difficult it can be when two people care deeply but both become so focused on protecting themselves that neither one ever discovers what might have happened if they had simply been honest. You had never mentioned their name. But the person listening understood. And later, they told the person you love something they could not forget. I think you're both waiting for the other person to become fearless first. That sentence landed like truth usually does. Quietly. Then all at once. The person you love looked at you now and admitted that those words stayed with them for weeks. Because they realized something uncomfortable. They had been calling their silence patience. But sometimes it was fear wearing a more respectable name. They had been calling their distance timing. But sometimes it was hesitation pretending to be wisdom. And what if both of you had continued doing that? What if years passed while two people waited for a perfect moment that was never going to arrive on its own? That possibility frightened them more than rejection ever had. So they made another decision. A private one. They would stop looking for certainty in your behavior and start creating clarity through their own. That decision became the beginning of every change you had witnessed. The notebook. The future plans. The choice not to leave. And eventually, the confession in front of everyone. But there was one part of that morning they had never written down. The person who contacted them had said one final thing before ending the conversation. Something so specific that the person you love initially thought it was strange. Watch what happens when you stop hiding. That was all. No explanation. No prediction. Just that line. And now, sitting with you after everything that had happened, they almost laughed at the memory. Because look at what happened when they stopped hiding. A crowded room went silent. A truth that had been buried came into the open. People who had misunderstood the connection began seeing it differently. And most importantly, the two of you were finally sitting across from each other without pretending there was nothing to discuss. This was not magic. It was momentum. One honest action creating room for another. One truth making the next truth easier to speak. And that may be the real reason this story feels bigger than one public declaration. The scream was only the visible moment. The transformation had been happening long before anyone heard it. Then the person you love reached for the notebook again. They turned past several filled pages until they reached one you had not seen. This one contained only a single sentence. No date. No explanation. Just one question. If they say yes to beginning again, what truth must I tell them next? You stared at the words. Then at them. They closed their eyes for half a second. Because apparently, even after everything they had already revealed, there was still one truth they believed you deserved to hear before the two of you could take another step. And judging by the way their voice changed when they finally began speaking, this truth was not about the past. It was about what they had already set in motion for the future. The truth waiting on that final page was not a secret about what had already happened. It was a decision about what could happen next. The person you love looked at you with an expression you had not seen before. Not excitement. Not nervousness. Resolve. And somehow, that was more powerful than everything else. They turned the notebook toward you. There, written in careful handwriting, was a plan. Not a fantasy. Not a perfect ending. A real plan. A series of choices they had already begun making so that their life would finally reflect the words they had screamed in front of everyone. They had rearranged priorities. Closed certain doors. Created space. Stopped delaying conversations that mattered. And most importantly, they had decided they were no longer going to build a future that required them to constantly hide the most important parts of themselves. You read slowly. Every line revealed something different. A goal they wanted to pursue. A habit they wanted to change. A fear they wanted to stop allowing to control their decisions. Then came the line that made you look up. I want to become someone who can stay when life becomes uncertain. The person you love did not look away. That sentence was not really about romance. It was about character. About becoming stronger than the old pattern of disappearing whenever something felt too important. Stay with this moment, because what happened next proved that the public confession had never been the ending. It had been a beginning. They told you that after the crowd had gone home, after everyone had replayed the dramatic moment in their minds, they had realized something surprising. Screaming, "I love you," was easy compared with what came afterward. Anyone can be brave for a few seconds. The real test is what someone does when the music stops, the crowd disappears, and ordinary life returns. Would they still communicate? Would they still listen? Would they still choose honesty when nobody was watching? Would they still respect your pace? That was the future they wanted to prove through actions. And for the first time, you understood why they had refused to demand an answer from you. They did not want your emotions captured by the intensity of one unforgettable night. They wanted your trust earned slowly. That realization changed something inside you. Because the person standing before you was no longer asking you to believe a declaration. They were inviting you to observe a transformation. Then they reached for one final envelope. Smaller than the first. Your name was not written on it this time. Instead, the front contained 2 words. Open later. You smiled. Another secret? They smiled back. Not exactly. Inside was a blank card. Completely blank. You looked at them, confused. And they explained. That one is for whatever happens next. No prediction. No predetermined ending. No pressure to make the story fit somebody else's expectations. Just an empty page. Your future. Unwritten. And perhaps that was the greatest revelation of all. The person you love had spent so long trying to predict every outcome that they nearly lost the courage to live one. Now they were finally willing to step forward without demanding guarantees. What if that is what real change looks like? Not knowing exactly where the road leads, but becoming someone capable of walking it with awareness. You placed the blank card back inside the envelope. The sun was beginning to shift in the distance, casting everything around you in a different light. And then your phone vibrated again. One notification. A photograph had been sent to you. You opened it. It was from the crowded confession earlier. Someone had captured the exact second the person you love shouted those words in front of everyone. But the photograph contained something neither of you had noticed at the time. In the background, one person was holding something. A small sign. 4 handwritten words were visible. And when the person you love leaned closer to read them, their expression changed completely. Because those 4 words revealed that someone else had known this confession was coming. Before either of you ever arrived there that day. The 4 words on that sign were almost impossible to ignore. Tonight, truth chooses courage. You stared at the photograph again. The person you love went completely still. Because the person holding that sign was someone neither of you remembered seeing in the crowd. No familiar face. No obvious connection. Just a figure standing several steps behind everyone else, holding a message that seemed strangely aligned with what had happened only seconds later. For a moment, the entire story felt as though another layer had quietly opened. Who were they? How did they know? And why had those exact words appeared before the confession? The person you love enlarged the photograph. That was when another detail appeared. Around the stranger's wrist was a small band carrying a symbol. The same symbol printed on the corner of the old notebook page. You noticed it first. Their expression changed when you pointed it out. Because that notebook had been bought months earlier from a tiny shop they had entered almost accidentally. And suddenly they remembered something they had forgotten. The person who sold it to them had said one unusual sentence while handing it over. Keep the pages for the things you're not ready to say yet. At the time, they had smiled and thought nothing of it. Now those words felt completely different. Stay with this moment, because nobody was claiming that the future had been predicted. The truth was even more interesting. Sometimes unrelated moments begin to feel connected only when your choices give them meaning. A notebook. A sentence. A photograph. A public confession. Each seemed ordinary by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. Not a pattern telling you what must happen. A pattern reminding you how long this truth had been waiting to be acknowledged. The person you love lowered the phone. Then they said something that surprised you. I spent so much time searching for signs that I ignored the one thing I already knew. You asked what they meant. They looked at you. You mattered to me. That was the truth. I kept thinking I needed something outside myself to prove it. That sentence changed the mood instantly. Because perhaps the stranger in the photograph was never the important mystery. Perhaps the important mystery was why people sometimes trust coincidence more easily than their own deepest clarity. Why wait for the universe to shout when your own heart has been whispering consistently? Why demand absolute certainty before taking one honest step? The person you love had finally stopped doing that. And that was why everything had changed. But the story still had another turn waiting. You zoomed farther into the photograph. Behind the person holding the sign was a building. On its glass entrance, a name was visible. The person you love recognized it immediately. So did you. It was the same location written at the bottom of the page you had received earlier. The place where they had invited you to meet. Except there was one problem. That photograph had been taken hours before they wrote that location onto your note. You looked at them. They looked at you. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then they reached for their phone and opened an old message thread. There it was. A message sent that morning from an unknown number. Only one sentence. When you finally tell the truth, bring them where the future can begin. Below it was the exact same location. Now the question was no longer simply who had known about the confession. Someone had been quietly guiding pieces of this moment into place. And the person you love had never told you about that message. Not because they wanted to hide it. Because they had assumed it meant nothing. Until now. Their voice dropped almost to a whisper. There's one more thing. You waited. They scrolled upward. Another message appeared above the first. Sent several weeks earlier. It contained your name. And beneath your name was a sentence that made both of you realize the final chapter of this story might have begun long before either of you understood what was happening. Long before the confession echoed through that crowded room, someone had already written your name into the story. The message on the screen had been sent weeks earlier. No introduction. No explanation. Just your name followed by one sentence. When the moment comes, do not choose silence again. The person you love stared at those words as though they were seeing them for the first time. They remembered receiving the message. They remembered reading it. And they remembered dismissing it because, at that point, they had no idea what the moment was supposed to mean. Now they did. The crowded room. The sudden courage. The confession that escaped louder than they had planned. The shocked faces. The note. The invitation. Everything seemed to circle back toward one simple truth. They had reached a moment where silence was no longer protecting anything. It was only delaying honesty. But something about the message still bothered you. Not in a frightening way. In a curious way. Who had sent it? The person you love finally decided to call the number. The phone rang once. Twice. Then someone answered. And the voice on the other end immediately made them sit upright. They knew that voice. It belonged to the same person who had questioned them the morning after they nearly walked away. The person who had once said, "Are you sure you're leaving for the right reason?" For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the person on the other end laughed softly. I wondered when you would finally connect everything. The mystery suddenly became smaller. More human. And somehow, more meaningful. There had been no secret force controlling the story. No impossible prediction. Just someone who had watched two people repeatedly step toward honesty and then retreat. Someone who understood that the person you love did not need another opinion. They needed courage. The messages had been gentle reminders. Nothing more. Nothing less. But wait. There was still one question. Why that location? The answer surprised both of you. Because years earlier, the person sending those messages had once stood in that very place while making one of the biggest decisions of their own life. They had chosen honesty there. And when they saw the person you love repeating the same cycle of hesitation, they thought perhaps the place could become symbolic again. Not magical. Meaningful. A location associated with choosing clarity over avoidance. The person on the phone said something you would remember for a long time. Sometimes people do not need someone to decide their future. They just need someone to remind them that they are allowed to be brave inside it. Then the call ended. No dramatic revelation followed. And that was exactly what made the moment powerful. Because suddenly all the mystery pointed back towards something beautifully simple. Choice. The person you love had not been pushed into confessing. They had chosen to. They had not been guaranteed your answer. They had chosen honesty anyway. And now the next choice belonged to you. You looked at the blank card again. The one labeled for whatever happened next. For the first time, you understood why it had been left empty. Nobody else could write this part. Not the crowd. Not the person sending messages. Not the past. Not even the person sitting across from you. You picked up the pen. They watched quietly. You wrote one sentence. Then turned the card around. Let's discover what happens when neither of us hides. Their eyes remained on the words for several seconds. Then came the smallest smile of the entire story. No shouting this time. No audience. No dramatic declaration. Just relief. Because the person who had once screamed their love for you in front of everyone had finally received something far more valuable than an instant perfect ending. A beginning built on mutual truth. And perhaps that was what nobody in that crowd could have believed would happen next. The loud confession became a quiet conversation. The mystery became understanding. The hesitation became possibility. And the future? The future remained unwritten. Exactly as it should. Because some of the greatest chapters do not begin when two people know everything. They begin when two people finally stop pretending they feel nothing. And somewhere behind you, the world continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But both of you knew better. Everything had changed. Not because someone screamed, "I love you." Because this time, someone was finally ready to live like those words meant something.